Hello, everyone. My name is Darren Card, and I'm an evolutionary biologist and geneticist at the Museum of Comparative Zoology at Harvard University. Today, I'm going to be presenting on learning to speak DNA and how we can use this skill to understand how snakes have lost their arms and legs. So nature is full of interesting organisms, many of which have unique or amazing traits that we commonly observe with our own eyes. Here are examples from vertebrates, the animals most similar to humans. A major research question in biology is how so many diverse body forms and characteristics are encoded in our DNA, which is the blueprint or recipe for building all of the traits that an organism exhibits. More specifically, many scientists are extremely interested in understanding what parts of DNA are important for building the interesting traits that different organisms exhibit. My work focuses on reptiles, and one good example of a reptile with a very interesting trait is snakes. Snakes have a lot of cool characteristics, but the most obvious one is the complete lack of arms and legs. Scientists typically refer to arms and legs as limbs, and biologists, especially evolutionary geneticists like me, are very excited to understand how the genetic code in a snake's DNA, which we can see displayed on the right, builds a complete organism with all of its interesting characteristics, which we see observed on the left. But in the case of snakes, a major question is what genes are causing the missing arms and legs in these organisms? Now, you may be thinking, well, just sequence a snake's DNA and it will tell us the answer to that question, right? The human genome was sequenced over 20 years ago, so we must now know how DNA encodes for all the instructions for building a whole organism and all of its interesting traits. However, just because we can sequence an organism's DNA to determine the ordering of nucleotides in their genome does not mean that we can read the instructions encoded in those nucleotides. In fact, we often have very limited understanding of how DNA encodes for biological traits. And this is actually a major area of active research among scientists today. So, how are scientists tackling this problem? Well, I think a useful analogy for understanding one approach scientists take to connect DNA to traits is to think of your favorite dessert like this delicious brownie. Many of us like brownies because of the unique characteristics that they have, especially the sweet flavor. In our analogy, the snake is like a brownie. And while snakes have DNA that is used to develop the physical traits that make a snake, a brownie is instead created using a written recipe. However, in our analogy, the recipe for the brownie cannot be easily read nor understood. Like this. Looking at the symbols on the right, we may observe a common alphabet, such as A's, B's, C's, and so on. Or even repeated groups of symbols like words, such as those highlighted here. However, unfortunately, in practice, it is very difficult to look at these instructions and understand which words, letters, or phrases are important for the unique characteristics that emerge in a finished brownie. But if we focus on the defining characteristic of a brownie, its sweet flavor, and think more broadly about other foods that are sweet, we may find a solution to our problem. Can you think of other foods that are sweet? I'm sure you can. Here are various desserts which, like our brownie, have a sweet flavor. And their recipes, which we cannot decipher. It is still very challenging to understand how each recipe is used to make any single dessert in isolation. But given all of these foods are sweet, maybe there will also be portions of the recipes that are similar because they are important for the sweet taste that we perceive. Therefore, with more examples, it is now possible to look for shared features across the recipes that might help us understand the words, letters, and phrases that are most important for the shared characteristics of desserts, their sweet flavor. This is like finding shared words or phrases across these recipes, such as those highlighted here. Given that all these food items are sweet desserts, and all of them share these words or phrases, it is very likely that these portions of the recipes are what is vital for making a dessert sweet. Now, let's bring this back to the problem of deciphering how the DNA code controls for the development of traits in an organism. What we essentially have here is a recipe card for creating the snake on the left, using the difficult to understand DNA code on the right. Well, just like we observed with the desserts, with only a single example to focus on, it is very difficult to understand what pieces of DNA are responsible for the missing arms and legs we observe in snakes. So, where does one look for a solution to this problem? Well, some scientists, including me, are looking to lizards. But wait, you say, lizards have arms and legs, so why would they be useful in helping us to understand how an organism loses its arms and legs? Well, not so fast, I say. It's not very widely known, but aside from snakes, which are actually a type of lizard, there are many other examples of reduced or lost arms and legs within lizards. Here's an evolutionary tree showing the major groups of lizards, including snakes, and their relationships. As you can see, it turns out that many other lizard groups have species with reduced or missing arms or legs, which are indicated in orange here. We think that this transition towards a snake-like body form has occurred more than 25 times in lizards alone. And as a researcher here at Harvard, I'm currently studying the genetics of reduction and loss of arms and legs in a group of roughly 100 skink lizards found in Australia. This group is very interesting because there are some species with normal limbs, like most lizards, and also some species that lack arms and legs entirely, like a snake. We also observe that some species have various numbers of missing fingers or toes, or that some have like a tiny stump as a limb. Therefore, this is a really interesting group of lizards in which to study the evolution and genetics of arm and leg reduction, which I do using a combination of field expeditions, laboratory research, and a lot of computer analysis. And in parallel, other research groups across the world are also studying the reduction of arms and legs in various groups of lizards. Scientists are only beginning to sequence the DNA of many of these groups. So at this point, we don't have a really clear answer for what portions of DNA drive reduction or loss of limbs in lizards. However, using what we have learned from our desserts analogy, we can understand how scientists may one day uncover what portions of DNA cause reduced or lost arms and legs within reptiles. Here are 4 examples of lizards with reduced or lost arms and legs from the evolutionary tree we were just looking at, including our original example of snakes. In essence, we will create recipe cards for each of these organisms by reading or sequencing the DNA of each animal. Again, we are met with the difficulty of understanding the link between DNA and the traits, especially considering that each animal one at a time. We can instead look across the DNA we sequence in each species with reduced or lost arms and legs for shared patterns that might point us towards the sections that cause this unique trait. Can you find the shared patterns in these recipes? I'll pause briefly, but feel free to pause this video if you'd like some more time. Perhaps you were successful in locating this common stretch of DNA that is shared by each organism. Given that we have looked at similar traits across multiple organisms, it is much more likely that these shared elements cause arms and legs to be reduced or entirely missing within these organisms. One day, once we have built greater understanding of the DNA of each of these groups, we will be able to perform this comparison and link portions of DNA to the reduction or loss of arms and legs in reptiles. And perhaps we'll be able to look even more broadly to groups outside of reptiles. For instance, there are other organisms with reduced or lost arms and legs, such as caecilians, which are a type of amphibian, and whales, which are mammals. And we have a term we use when similar traits evolve independently in different organisms, and this term is called convergent evolution. In nature, we see many examples of convergent evolution. Arm and leg reduction or loss is just one, but perhaps you can think of some other ones. And when scientists observe convergent evolution, they get especially excited, especially me. First, because when a trait has evolved over and over again, it suggests that natural selection heavily favors these traits in different contexts, providing an opportunity to better understand the process of evolution in general. But also because, as you've learned today, convergent evolution can be very useful for helping scientists to learn to speak DNA. And with this knowledge, we can understand how DNA is used to build the interesting and unique organisms that we observe in nature.